Perfect. So let's get started, team. Okay. So hello, everybody. Hope everybody's doing well. This is Carlos here. Say hi, Paul.
Hello.
Perfect. That's all Paul is going to say. So, team, we're excited to welcome you to the second webinar. I know we had a lot of fun last Tuesday talking about momentum and structure. And I just wanted to, before we get started in what we're going to talk about today, I wanted to go back around the webinar series because I think this is important in the way that we develop our thinking. So last week, as you all know, we went through some of the introduction of the momentum and the structure, the traditions. Paul's going to do a little review in a second. And today, really, what we're going to talk about is, so if the last webinar, we were making this claim that there's these two dominant traditions, and really movement, revolution, change happens in the integration of them when there is momentum and structure. What's our theory? What's our understanding of the integration piece? That's what we're doing today. Next week, we're going to talk about, well, what are some of the best practices, or the hybrid model, as we call it, to doing the theory of integration. And then in the fourth webinar, we're going to talk about common problems. That's a little how we're organizing this information. So, Paul, can you give us a little quick review of the hybrid model and what we talked about last week, just in a minute?
So, last webinar, we were talking about that there's two dominant organizing traditions that we experience in the United States and also that emerge in lots of other movements across the globe. And we call those structure and momentum. The structure and momentum tradition each have different strengths and weaknesses, and they work in different contexts. But the momentum tradition is a lot about creating these moments of the whirlwind, these moments that really change a lot of the public opinion. And we're going to talk more about that in this seminar. And civil resistance, which we'll get into now, is a lot about explaining why momentum works. Although a lot of civil resistance thinkers are not just in momentum, but there are integration between the two. But right now, we're really going to talk and use a lot of the theory of civil resistance, but we're also going to try to bring in some structure stuff to talk about how to make the basic theory of momentum work better. And this is what we call the hybrid.
Thank you, Paul. So, team, let's continue. And actually, the way that we're going to rock and roll in this webinar is that if you have any questions or thoughts, we're not going to do many breaks. Like the last one. So if you have a question, just write it down. Belinda will let us know when there's a question so we can stop, address your question, and continue based on the content that we have. But we'll try to put some breaks there and see where it is. But we're going to try to really go through this whole thing and then get questions and discussions going. Perfect. So, team, the first thing is that when we talked about this integration piece and the theory of integration, we're not the first one. Paul and I are not the first ones to talk about this or to even put this in words. So, for example, if we really look at this, or we look at the Mahatma Gandhi here on the left top side of the screen, Gandhi was the first one that really, I think in many ways understood how these two dynamics played, even though he didn't really name them, but understood how they work. So, for example, in India, they had the Indian National Congress, where they really developed around the structure work, right? The political party, a lot of team building, committees across the country working for local needs, really trying to figure out, because the party was going to be the vanguard of what they were going to build in the country. But then Gandhi will do these crazy momentum moments like the Salt March, and many leaders in India would say, well, Gandhi is just like a magician or something, because he's like, it's magic. Like, how do people come out of the woodwork and they want to have massive arrests and they want to give their lives to the movement? They didn't understood this. They thought it was magic because they didn't understand the science before it. But actually, Gandhi thought it was a science. And actually, the guy took his right. Gene Sharp is a scholar. Actually, he lives here in my neighborhood in East Boston. And Gene Sharp spent a lot of his time in his life actually understanding what Gandhi was talking about in the context of his fight and struggle in India, but specifically systematizing the momentum element of Gandhi's thinking. Actually, he didn't systematize too much the structure thinking that Gandhi also had put, because they had also a lot of structure and a lot of momentum happening in the independence movement. So Gene Sharp wrote a set of books, which we will see actually, like one of them being The Dynamics of Nonviolent Action, or From Dictatorship to Democracy, that became still very popular books that they have used in so many revolutions across the world. But Gene Sharp then, through many of his writings, created a field of civil resistance by systematizing some of his thinking of how Gandhi did the Indian independence movement, and then he studied a bunch of other movements to understand this. And actually, out of Gene Sharp and out of the field, there's key organizations. At least the one key in the U.S. is the International Center for Nonviolent Conflict. And there's scholars there like Erica Chanowit, which is in the picture below, that are writing consistently about this topic and really make it happen. You also see another organization there like the Albert Einstein Institute, which is Gene Sharp's organization. That's just a little bit about the field. The second piece around the field is that because this field has been developed in the last couple of decades, there is not a group of people that are also scholars and researchers that are looking at movements, which Erica Chanowit, you see the book for there, Why Civil Resistance Worked, and Paul's going to name her and quote her in some of his presentations as we go in, right? But there's also practitioners, people that are across the world using this stuff from the civil resistance field, and there's also a set of trainers, like the folks at Canvas. That's pretty much the training organization. They came out of the struggle in Serbia with the Serbian students in Otborg. So that's a little bit about the field of civil resistance. Two last parts that I would add to this is the one, while the field is really communicating this development of power and its development of how to bring down a dictator or how to pledge this large momentum-driven campaigns that involve the public across a country, they're not really yet focused on the integration of structure and momentum, which for us, that is what the field is missing, and that's where we feel we can come in and be supportive of the field. Because actually the field tells you, well, great, there's all this power dynamics, talk to the people, do mass demonstration, and get the whole public involved, but they don't actually talk about the specific details of how you do that to build organization to get you to that point, which you will see as we go through the next couple of slides. Paul, before we go to the elements of theory, is there something you want to add on the civil resistance piece?
I just want to say that when I studied this in college, I was like, well, what does this theory really have to teach me? Now I realize that the theory and all these academics actually have so much that's relevant. And to me, it's so cool that there's this whole academic field that researches and develops theory, but it takes us translating that into what is practical for activists, for us to realize just how important it is. And it took me a long time to do that. So I don't necessarily recommend just reading Gene Sharp, but I want to really validate that it's amazing that this field, there's a whole field, academic field of study on how to bring down dictators and how to build social movements.
There's pretty much a field on the science of revolutions. That's what it is, right? Okay, so let's get into the theory, team. We just want to make sure you know that the field is there. So, Paul, can you get us to the three elements?
So we're going to talk, before we get into the details of how to organize, which is the next webinar. We're going to talk about models of how to do this integration and how other people have done it. We're really going to take you through the theory of why this stuff works, okay? And we want you to leave with 3 points, 3 major points in the theory. 1, active popular support, the importance of active popular support. 2, escalation. And 3, how to absorb momentum, how you absorb the energy that's created through escalation. Those are the 3 things we're going to go over in this webinar.
And if people can tattoo them to yourself, if you put a tattoo in your arm that says those 3 things, active popular support, escalation, and absorption, we are on the right side.
That's hardcore, Carlos. That's hardcore.
Every day. Okay, rock and roll, bro.
So first, I'm going to talk about active popular support. And I want to say this. I have been in many movements, from the anti-globalization movement to Occupy to the labor movement, and most of the strategic debates that you have to do with conflicting theories of change, basic differences in how we conceptualize how we win and how we make change. And active popular support is our basic theory that is really grounded in the field of civil resistance, and it's basically the theory that explains how almost all social movements have worked. Frances Fox Pippin did a historical analysis, and she believes the active popular support is the reason why every major social movement in the United States of America won what it won, whether it's women's suffrage, the civil rights movement, the abolitionist movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement in the 60s, you name it, is because of this theory of change. And there's other theories of change that people are debating about, or the public has a very skewed notion of a theory of change, and the media has a very skewed notion of a theory of change. So this concept is super important. Carlos? So out there, most people in the public believe in a monolithic power model of power, not a pluralistic one. There's two major models of power, and the monolithic one is the idea that the person at the top of the institution has the real power. So we see this all the time. Who's at fault when a corporation fires all its workers? It's the CEO. And people get really mad at the face of the CEO. Who is mad if Obama does something? They're mad at Obama. They're not mad at his advisors. They're not mad at all the circumstances that create that, him making that decision. They really get mad at Obama. And we think that politicians have the real power to change everything in our political system. This is the monolithic power model, and this is what the public mostly thinks. Next. But in civil resistance and in movements, we need to see things differently. We need to see that the power in society ultimately comes from the people, and the rulers only have the power which the people provide to them. Okay? So on this model, the people are very important, and the people determine what the decision makers do, whether it's the CEO or the politicians or you name it. The people have the power. Next. If we believe that the power resides solely on the one person at the top, then we conclude that the only way to make change is through the individual. Okay? Now, this isn't just about whether or not we can change their mind, which a lot of the public believes that the way you change things is you have a real intellectual dialogue or some form of dialogue with those. This is a liberal notion of change that is predominant, is that we can sort of change the mind through dialogue of the people on top. But if we really believe that the people have the power, and we need to have a bigger concept of how do people have power and how do we move the people? How do we get them to realize that they have the power and how to exercise that power to change the politician? And it's not just voting. We're going to get over it. It's not just voting. So how do we get it so that the people can have that understanding? Our central task of a social movement is to win the hearts, minds, and the support of the majority of populace, because it is the people who ultimately hold the power. They will either preserve the status quo or create change. Well, how do they do that? Next. This is called the pillars of support. And what we mean is that anybody who's elected into the state, even CEOs, whoever's in power, relies on a lot of institutions to do what they do. They rely on the educational system to get data, to get statistics, to have experts, to provide them with information they need to conduct business, to do policy analysis. They need the police to enforce their laws. They need businesses to give them money or to participate in what they do. They need the government's support. At certain levels, they need a lot of things to make it happen. And a lot of times, if things are going smoothly at the status quo, no one really thinks about that, because inherently in the status quo, a lot of times it's supporting the people on the top. But what we are thinking about pluralistically is thinking about the pillars of support and realizing that they have power. Every pillar has power, and they have a power in a lot of different unique ways. Each pillar has power in influencing the top. The educational system can withdraw their support or provide the special resources that they have towards the movement and not towards the people with power. And the same thing goes with the police. The same thing goes with other people. So last time we talked a little bit about polarization. We talked about the spectrum of support that we're trying to pull the public towards the movement. And we talked about active allies. That is what we call active public support. It means that members of the public who actively support change, that will vote, that will act, that will demonstrate, that will persuade, they will donate, and they'll non-cooperate based on a movement issue. Okay? So we're trying to conceptualize how do we get not just the public to support us passively, but how to get them to support us actively. Next. And what Erica Chenoweth said in her data, which was really amazing, she analyzed all these different movements and created this huge data set of sort of what were effective movements, what were non-effective movements, in violent and nonviolent revolutions. And what she said is that the quintessential factor for making success is what she calls the sustained participation of the population in the movement. And she says around 3.5% of the population, somewhere around there. You can get a little bit less, you can get a little bit more, but once you get these people to give you active public support and you get that sustained, it's very hard for the people on top to maintain whatever they're doing, even if they disagree with you, because then they lose the support that they need to function. So what is active popular support? What is active popular support? It's voting, it's acting in a whole bunch of different ways. It's protesting, it's persuading other people, it's donating to the movement, and it's non-cooperating in the status quo. And there's so many examples of this. But in a dictatorship, it's really interesting because a lot of times they don't have the power to vote. In Egypt, the whole electoral system was totally corrupt. So they had to focus more on acting and protesting and persuading and non-cooperating and creating general strikes to move the person on top, to move the public. Basically, to do all those things, to get active public support, to polarize the public. We really focus mostly on voting, but the movement needs to think about its power much more broadly than just voting, because even some of the most conservative presidents did progressive things because of the pressure. Nixon, for instance, who was a very conservative president, was in a time of social movement activity, and he passed the EPA. The EPA is still one of the most progressive pieces of legislation that has been passed in the last 100 years, and he's a conservative president. How did that happen? It's because the movement and a lot of things happened so that he was pressured. The climax was created. Lyndon Johnson was not supportive in his early days of civil rights. He changed because of the pressure that was created by the civil rights movement. So we're going to go back to the spectrum of support. The goal is that we push the people towards our side. We push people from, everybody generally moves from being a passive opponent to being a hostile neutral, to being neutral, to be a friendly neutral, passive allies to active allies to the movement. So we're trying to move everyone towards the movement. But in reality, normally it's an 80-20 split in the United States of America. Most movements don't polarize everyone towards us. They polarize a percentage, a small percentage. In the civil rights movement, actually, there was a segment of the southern white population that were empowered, like Bull Connor. They think one of the reasons why he let out the dogs and the fire hoses is because he thought he would be empowered, and he looked really, people would love him because he cracked down hard on the civil rights people. on the protesters. So, and that's true. He was really elevated as a national figure among those people, but he isolated himself from the majority of the population. The same thing in the immigrant rights movement in 2006. The movement, if you look at the polling, polarized a lot of people, and this hurt the Republicans tremendously. They lost like anywhere from a quarter to half of all Latino Republicans fled the Republican Party after the immigrant rights protests in 2006. But racist Republicans were emboldened. The Minutemen expanded, almost doubled in size after 2006. So the polarization goes both ways. But our goal is to polarize most of the public towards us and turn them into active allies and also turn them into movement participants. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. So I just want to make this distinction. And this is I want everyone to really think about this in their context, within their movement. Most of the strategic debate is because people don't realize that we're running campaigns and we're picking demands because of the influence it has in polarizing the public to us. Okay? Gandhi picked SALT primarily because of its influence in affecting the public, the Indian public, to come to his side. The structured approach or the electoral approach, or even some anarchists who want to be disruptive, they're really thinking, how do we move the person on top without really talking about the public? All your tactics, almost everything you can think, you need to think, how does this move the public towards us? How does this gain participation? How does this generate momentum? And the movement orientation is dramatically different because we're focusing on the public. While most people in the structured approach or the electoral approach is really just thinking about the public in a very narrow term. They're really just thinking about how to move people to vote a certain way, then to move the politician. There's similarities, but it's a much more narrow concept of power that is really more focused on either being disruptive to those that are at the top, or by moving them through leverage, through very small portions of the public influencing the top with swing voters or something. What we're talking about is changing the political climate so that lots of the public is actively supporting us and putting pressure on the politician. And that changes the way we think about campaigns, that changes the way we think about tactics, that changes the way we think about movement, because the solution is the movement. Disrupting, we don't actually change things through disrupting business unless we could do it at a scale that's much bigger than what most people conceptualize it. And so the disruptive power is really us thinking about how it influences the public. Disruption is important because it helps us polarize, because it helps us bring public awareness. It's primarily symbolic in its nature. That doesn't mean that it's not instrumental, and that it doesn't mean that it doesn't have impact on the person in power, but that's secondary. The disruption primarily has power because it allows us to get attention and build our movement. So we have to think, how do what we do build momentum in the movement? And we call this the cycle of momentum. And the cycle of momentum, we think, has three things. You have a strong movement organization that engages in nonviolent actions for popular demand. That creates trigger events, moments of the whirlwind. It creates different media spectacles, sometimes even small things that generate some attention. And then that creates popular support for the movement through polarization. And then the movement needs to absorb that to create a stronger organization so it can do the same thing over again. That's the cycle. And we're going to talk about how that cycle works or doesn't work. But ideally, if you could do that in multiple cycles, every time you do either a big action or a small action, You want it to move and polarize the public, gain popular support, and build a stronger organization through absorption. So you have a strong organization, nonviolent action demands, creates moments of the whirlwind, trigger events, and polarization that then create popular support for the movement that you try to absorb into a stronger organization. So this is how it all works together. So as you see, you go through the cycle, you create trigger events and whirlwinds. That polarizes things, and the polarization pulls the pillars out from underneath those in power. And then when they no longer have the support, they fall, their power is diminished, and they have to concede to your demands. So this is what we go through the cycle again and again and again, continuing to polarize and create trigger events. Those trigger events we're going to talk about, whirlwinds and trigger events, that polarizes the public and pulls people from the pillars so that the guy on top topples. But we're really focusing on the pillars, not on the guy on top. How do we successfully polarize the public? Now I'm going to give this over to Carlos.
Thank you, Paul. And team, before we go into that, I wanted to just get Belinda back here. Belinda, is there any questions from any participants on the active popular support? I want to make sure that we hear some thoughts or some questions before we continue with the second piece, which is escalation.
Right. So we don't have any questions as of right now, but folks, we definitely encourage you, if you have any questions, definitely submit them, even if they're not fully formed, complete thoughts. If you're just like, what's up with that thing that he said? I don't know about that. That's totally cool too. We just really want to facilitate your participation because that's how we learn.
Can we get feedback? Was that helpful for people? I need to know. I can't see you, so it's harder for me to attune to you. So I need a little bit of feedback. Can people tell me if it was helpful or not and how it was helpful?
And it will be good, team, if you can put on the chat as we move forward because of time. If you can just put what parts maybe of that, what Paul, a specific teaching that he said, what was useful for that you heard? Like, oh, I really like this part about the polarization here, or I like this part about the pillars here, just so we know what's actually, what are the points that are really hitting or making sense to all of you. So team, I'll continue. So Paul pretty much said the first thing, right? So team, again, we're only talking about two things in this webinar. We're talking about, well, one is the theory, which is the active popular support, the escalation piece, and the absorption piece, right? And Paul has really put this out there, which is like we need to engage the whole public. We need to engage the masses. And if the masses do massive non-cooperation, right? Oh, that's pretty much what voting, donating, all that happens, right? They massively non-cooperate with the system in place. And if we just get 3.5%, which is around 11 million people here in our U.S. context, then the rulers, the people at the top, will not be able to deal with us. So then the question is like, okay, well, Paul, Carlos, that sounds pretty cool, but how do we get 3.5 million people involved?
Hey, so we actually just got a bunch of comments if you want to hear them.
Woo! Okay, yeah.
So Curtis said that it was very helpful. However, he's wondering how we translate momentum organizing to issues. So that it has been utilized largely in toppling dictators, but how could we adapt it in the U.S. to, for example, taking on the prison industrial complex? And then Zane said, helpful reminder of the consent theory of power, and Kurt thought the graphics and visuals were important, and Zane is also interested in the contrast between strategic polarization to build popular support and structure and electoral theories. So that was a lot. Let me know if you want me to repeat it.
This is good. Paul, you want to take a quick answer?
I just want to say one of the critical elements that happens a lot in all the consulting I do with the labor movement or with the immigrant rights movement or whoever movement I'm participating in is what I call instrumental versus symbolic demand. In that, when the civil rights movement in Birmingham is picking demands, it's local. They're picking local demands, but primarily the most important thing about those things is that the influence nationally. They're playing a local game so that they can polarize the entire population. If you are a structured person and you're gonna think, I'm gonna escalate and spend millions of dollars and I'm gonna engage this whole population to win these very small demands, you'd be like, it's not worth the money. Like, it's not worth the resources. It's not worth the people participating. 4 black schoolgirls were killed in a church as martyrs for that movement. So was all that life and all the expense, was that worth it? And if we look about it as a historical event, that is one of the biggest historical events in the lifetime of my parents. It's etched in the memories of many people, and it changed public opinion in a way that no one, I think, could have predicted. It was amazing, but the demands that they were working on were very small. They were symbolic, just like SALT. I mean, it had some influence, definitely, but it was primarily symbolic. That's what was won in the SALT campaign, was a way in which they could elevate the issue of oppression with the British government. And later, when they won public opinion, everything else falls. That's a different way of thinking. So you can pick symbolic demands and symbolic victories, but really what you're thinking is, what is the best things to select that's going to polarize the public?
And just to add, Curtis, to your question, yes, you can do this on issue campaigns. And I'll talk a little about how it works in the context of the DREAM Act campaign. But I would say there's a big difference when you're trying to target a specific target or politician or corporation, and the big difference when you're trying to target the whole public. And I think that's a big distinction that we want people to make out of the active popular support, right? That most of the times when we talk about issues, we talk about how can my organization address this instrumental issue like ending prison or ending private prisons, right? And how would that work? And what I think maybe Paul and I would say, and Paul, please correct me on this one, is that we want to look at the issue in a not in an instrumental way, meaning of the actual demands of ending private prisons, even though that's what we want, but actually of what would that look symbolically for the American public to get active in a campaign like that. Because we're thinking about how to engage the whole public in that. So yes, it will work on issues, it's just we have to figure out how to frame it. So I'll continue just because of the time frame, and then we'll come back to more questions. But then the question really becomes, right? So we're polarizing the public, and how do we get 3.5 million people here? How do we get people activated? My claim, the second part of theory, is that we do that through escalation. And escalation is what creates momentum. I don't know if you can tattoo that in your arm, put it in your notebook, put it in your bed, put it anywhere you want, but escalation creates momentum. And that's the equation that we want to drive through in the next couple of slides. Again, we're thinking the cycle, and this is how we put all the theory, put them in this cycle. So you can see step number 1, you build a strong movement organization. Step number 2, you do massive nonviolent action for a popular demand. This is very important, a popular demand. We're going to come back to this. And third, that creates popular support for the movement, which then we can inject back into the organization. So we're going to talk in the next slides, how do we make that happen, right? But you would say to me, well, Carlos, how do we create the momentum piece? And I will actually love to go back here to the slide where you see those that says TE, those little stars that TE, those are for trigger events. So those to me are the big actions, and Paul's going to go through some historical pieces. So you can see how those big moments create the whirlwind moments, or the large momentum moments that actually generate massive popular support, right? But most of us have not, I think, on this webinar actually created a moment of the whirlwind. I've been part of the SB 1070 when it happens in Arizona, the 2006 immigrant rights. I've been part of it, but I wasn't part of creating it. Actually, most of the things were created by external factors. But actually, there's plenty of ways to escalate. And there's some that are small, there's some that are larger. There's actually a list of 198 methods that one of the scholars that we mentioned, Gene Sharp, put together many, many years ago, that you can see there's 198 ways he just documented from that time. What were all the things that he has seen people done, like picketing, like doing vigils, hunting officials or bird dogging, doing political mourning, renouncing honors, doing student strikes, withholding rent, civil disobedience, fast. You can imagine there's so many ways to escalate. But most of the times we get really blocked into saying, well, Carlos, I cannot have the largest protest in the world tomorrow, so I cannot create momentum. And actually, momentum sometimes is generated in small ways. So one way is you can do it in small actions. And this picture right here is actually Grace is right there. She's one of the organizers at United We Dream. But in 2010, we literally had many, many students in Congress. And this is actually in the Senate um, cafeteria. And we had maybe just around 20 to 30 students that day. And we had students on caps and gowns holding flags. And the interesting thing is like they couldn't kick us out. So their whole point was to disrupt the cafeteria and when people were eating to grab people's attention, right? And then the cameras were there and all the stuff. And then something that we will do consistently will be that maybe every 10 or 15 minutes, everybody will get up from their chairs and they will do the Pledge of Allegiance. And then all the cops will look at themselves like mesmerized, like should we just arrest the students while they're doing the Pledge of Allegiance or not? But they created such a little buzz in Congress. So sometimes you can have small actions that allow you to build more capacity for your organization, develop your strong leader so you can do actions that require much more effort. So that's one, small actions. You can also do protests with 10 people, 15 people. We interrupted President Obama in 2011 with 6 people out of 3,000 people that were at our conference. And only 6 people interrupted the president and make him, talk like a robot afterwards. So really small people can create significant impact, even like Kai, one of our friends from Paul and I, that did an action at the Supreme Court just a couple of weeks ago, or maybe about a month ago, that just he himself stand up and said his speech really interrupted, created media momentum, created more activists, more support. So the first one is small actions. The second one that I want to talk to you about is dilemma actions. And I know we mentioned a little bit last week, but I actually want to go over them again this week. And by dilemma actions, I mean actions that we set up from scratch that allow us to be in win-win situations and always put our enemies in lose-lose situations. So you say, well, Carlos, how the heck do we do that? Let me explain you how that would work. A couple of years ago, in the same campaign that I mentioned, we were in Congress. There was around 300 of us living literally in Washington, D.C. for 45 days, trying to push our vote on the DREAM Act. And we were doing caps and gowns, telling stories, everything we could do to get the media. And one time, the media just wouldn't pay attention to us for like 2 or 3 days, and we're just desperate. We're like, how can we get the media to pay attention to us, the dreamers? And we said to them, most of the times people think that immigrants take things from the country, that we take, tax money, we don't pay taxes, we get all these benefits. So we said, we're going to show the country that we want to serve them. So we set up all these blood drives across the country. We did, I think, maybe 5 or 6. And we had, many, many students line up in caps and gowns outside, ready to donate blood. And, we did this donation. Of course, like Red Cross is loving it because they want all the blood and all the good stuff. And we're there doing the blood donation. And then the media comes at around, noon or 1 because we invited them. And they said to many of us, well, Carlos, team, I don't understand what you're doing because you're here in Congress pushing for a vote. But now you're donating blood because you're giving service. We don't get this. And we said to them, no. The thing is very clear. Actually, what we're doing is we want to challenge the American public to see if they are willing to take our illegal blood or not. And they went a little crazy with it, right? So let me show you how some of the reactions were, right? First of all, look at the picture on the paper, right? It says, undocumented immigrant students give blood to show citizenship. This picture is actually from a blood drive in Harvard. Look at them. We look like we literally gave blood to the country. I mean, like, it's amazing, right? But let me tell you what the article said, because that's the coolest part, right? I'll just summarize it. It says how people were doing donating blood, right? But I'll tell you what the people's supporters said, and then what the opposition said, so you can see how this works. Then it says, U.S. Senator John Kerry from Massachusetts said the students are reminding everyone what it really means to be American. Oh my God, that is so nice. Thank you so much, Gary, right? Then he also said only 3 in 100 Americans will ever donate blood despite the need. But these kids are living out of the real full measure of citizenship, he said. They're living, breathing testimony of importance of passing the DREAM Act. So this is what I would say. If you take our illegal blood, which makes no sense, right? There's no blood that is illegal, but think about how we were challenging that frame of thinking. But if you take our illegal blood, you kind of have to support us, right? But if you don't take it, are you just against us, or who are you really against? Against the whole public, right? So this part here, Marie Parente, this is the opposition, right? A former Massachusetts state representative who opposed efforts to give the states illegal immigrants in-state tuition, said the blood donation drive did little to change her opinion that the DREAM Act was wrong. She compared illegal immigrants donating blood to win sympathy with serial killers donating blood to get off death row. What if a guy on death row says, I'll give you a pint of blood for the rest of my life just to get me out of here, said parent 82 Omer for its basis. So regardless of the comments of she said, she was totally out of touch, right? And really she was given a different perspective, and many other Republicans or people in the public were saying, well, I don't want to think like Parente. Parente is not, she's not right on this issue. How can she be saying that about those students that are trying to just to give blood to the country? So that's a way to put a dilemma action. Whatever the response was going to be, we were going to win. Actually, I wanted the Red Cross to throw our blood on the floor. I thought that was going to create more of a crisis, you know? Some of us thought about, well, maybe immigration is going to come and it's going to arrest us right there when we're donating blood. We're like, that's great. Do that. Do that. You know, and people were like, you're just crazy. They don't understand this because that's what creates the polarization with the public. So that's the second one, which is dilemma actions. But now, Paul's going to talk to us about the difference between these three ones. So we have the small actions, right? Dilemma actions apply to all the three of these ones, right? There are ones that apply to either the trigger events or the moments of the whirlwind. But now we're going to go to what are those big trigger events, those moments that really start getting momentum going, and then what are those moments of the whirlwind when shit goes crazy, right? And everybody wants to get engaged, and you have thousands of people ready to do something about it. So, Paul, can you lead us to triggers, events, and moments of the whirlwind?
Yes. So one of the reasons we're talking about these distinctions is because a lot of times structure-based organizers or just community organizers are not even thinking that it's possible to create trigger events or moments of the whirlwind. And for us, that's the goal. The goal is to create trigger events and moments of the whirlwind that can polarize the shit out of the public. And trigger events are probably what many people have experienced. Like, for instance, the Dream Defenders did this action with occupying the Capitol after Trayvon Martin verdict. That was definitely a trigger event. It got a lot of publicity, and because of that, it generated polarization in the public, and it created momentum in the movement. And in general, it was seen as successful. Some trigger events are externally created, like the Trayvon Martin verdict, meaning that the movement didn't create that. Circumstances outside the movement's control created it, but it generated a lot of momentum regardless, and then the movement took it and created an event around it. One of the keys to trigger events is just basically how much media you can get. You can get media in small actions, but once you get a critical mass of media, it really starts to create a momentum, and you see it because you see that your actions and your organizations are mobilizing people inside the structure and outside the structure. Moments of the whirlwind a lot of times happen because of multiple trigger events happen, and then all of a sudden you hit a trigger event out of the park. You get so much media that there's so much energy that people are doing actions in decentralized ways, a lot of times not even coordinated through the centralized leadership of the movement. It also, moments of the whirlwind are generally, actions are replicated because it's seen as a success. Whatever action that you did was seen as success, and it generated so much media that it creates this massive viral outbreak of the movement that spreads and generally hits the front page of the New York Times and the mainstream media. So I'm just going to go through some just to inspire us that movements, when we talk about polarization and really creating giant movements, a lot of times movements can trace this huge exponential growth and this viral growth to certain moments of the whirlwind and trigger events. And so I'm just going to talk about some of those in the next, 2 minutes, okay? So we had in India, one second, I'm getting back to the slide I want to go through. Well, anyways, so Carlos?
You got it, Paul? It's in there.
I know. Yeah, can you do that one real quick?
It's already in India.
So in India, they had like the Salt March. There was a massacre that created a lot of media attention and is now a historical. It's a historical event there. There is.
Mm-hmm.
Next slide. In the civil rights movement, there's a couple moment of the whirlwinds that everyone knows a lot about. One is the lunch counter student sit-ins, Birmingham, Selma. But even if you talk about those campaigns, which lasted for months, there's really moments that they sort of hit one out of the park. And one of those was when Bull Connor released the dogs and the fire hoses on the children. It was called D-Day in Birmingham. In Selma, it was called Bloody Sunday, when the police attacked a peaceful march of protesters. In the March on Washington, which now is such a etched memory in the collective consciousness. Every Martin Luther King Day, people talk about the big speech Martin Luther King made on the March on Washington. But all these things really created massive amounts of publicity. In the anti-war movement, there was the Chicago Democratic Convention, Kent State, where some students were killed by the National Guard, the free speech movement in Berkeley, and in the anti-nuclear movement, there was the Clamshell Alliance, which they shut down a nuclear power plant, and it got a lot of publicity, and they were able to spread virally after that. Also, there was a major trigger event around the long 3 Mile Island that everybody in the United States started thinking about how disastrous nuclear power could be. In the then there was in other countries. What's really interesting is in the color revolutions or the colored revolutions. They really created moments of the whirlwind around specific things. You can go into the pictures, but like in Egypt, in Serbia, they really created a trigger event around a general strike to enforce the elections that a lot of times had corruption within them. But a lot of the color revolutions created these moments of the whirlwind that then produced the downfall of the dictatorship. In Egypt, there was this day called the Day of Rage, which is kind of the explosive viral growth. In Arizona, in the immigrant rights movement, May 1st was a moment of the whirlwind. In Arizona, the SB 1070, when they passed that, there was massive marches. In LA, there was a 250,000 people marching in Los Angeles in response to SB 1070 when they passed the anti-immigrant bill there. In Occupy, there was a trigger event that I think was one thing that changed it into a small group that were not getting publicity to getting tons of publicity was both these women getting pepper sprayed. This YouTube video went viral, and also there was an event where 800 people got arrested on the Brooklyn Bridge that got front page New York Times coverage and really propelled Occupy Wall Street into the public consciousness, and then started spreading all around the country, partly because of great organizers like you guys, probably some people on the phone call, helped do that. But there's many different of those events. But I think what is really unique is that social movements really think about how in the hell can I create these moments of the whirlwind? How can I create these trigger events? And not just be victims of the political weather, but how do I create the political weather? And this happens on the right and the left. The Tea Party created a moment of the whirlwind around congressmen coming back to their states in these town hall meetings, and they interrupted it all across the country, and it got major publicity, and it changed the whole political weather for 3 or 4 months. So we have to ask, how in the hell do we do that, and how do we do it consistently? Because what was really unique about the civil rights movement is they created these moments of the whirlwind, and they knew and felt like they had a science of how to do that. And We call that prophetic promotion. It means that you need to do small actions, you need to do little trigger events and dilemma actions, but you also need to have a vision that's beyond your capacity to build to. In Serbia, that was a general strike to enforce an election. We have to have a vision that means if we had enough momentum, if thousands of people and millions of people want to participate, how do we take that, have a big escalation plan and a big vision? And if you build that vision, they will come. When you're a structure-based organizer, or if you're a community organizer and you're fighting about light posts, you're continuing incrementally, winning one thing after another. You're never thinking so big. In some ways, you're the catalyst that allows for everyone to come together, even if you don't have the organization to necessarily do it. You need to have some organization. But the critical thing is you need momentum, you need an escalation plan, and you need a big vision. If you have that and you're in the cycle, and you can create, it is possible to create trigger events and moments of the whirlwind. It's hard, it's complicated. We're not going to go into all the ways in which we think how you do that, but we just want people to have a sense that there really is an art to this, and there is thinkers. Gandhi believed that, he talked it was like a law of nature. He called Satyagraha. He had these different principles, and he believed that if you follow these sort of spiritual laws, that you can create a moment of the whirlwind. Like he says, it's like lighting a fire, a spark in a dry field, like a wildfire. You know, there is ways to set up everything in the context and the right movement organization for this to happen, and that is really what we want people to think about and imagine.
Thank you, Paul. Let's do the last review before we go into absorption, and then let's see if there's any questions. So, Paul, do you want to do a quick review?
So I just want to say again, you have a strong organization that does nonviolent action for popular demand, meaning that they're doing it specifically to polarize the public and win active public support. They do that sometimes in small actions, sometimes they create trigger events, and sometimes they create moments of the whirlwind that polarizes the public, and they gain popular support for the movement, and then they have to absorb that into the movement organization.
Perfect, and that's what I'm going to talk about. So, Belinda, before we move on, so we talked about active popular support, we talked about escalation in the small actions, in the trigger events, and in the moments of the whirlwind. We gave some examples. Now we're going to talk about, well, once you have popular support, how do you get into your organization? Are there any questions or comments, team, before we continue in the last part of our webinar?
So a couple of comments came in since the last time we checked in. Leland said that the piece about absorbing mass mobilization into the organization really resonated. And Curtis commented that he really loves the blood donation action, that it was brilliant. But maybe we should wait a couple minutes, because I'm noticing that when we pause like this, sometimes there's like a little bit of a delay in when people submit comments, so maybe we should wait a little bit.
Can we have people, is there people that are willing to talk just to tell me what was helpful, so I can get some emotional feedback about what was helpful about the last piece?
Before we do that, Paul, I'm sorry, Belinda, we have to wait at 8:30, right?
Yeah.
I would say let's continue for 15 minutes so we can end the last part, and then we can have 15 minutes of conversation. If people want to stay longer, we can do that too.
Thanks, Carla.
Okay. I just want to make sure we give all the content.
No, you're right. Thanks, Carla.
Okay. So we got one question / comment from Sharika. She says that we're doing great. And what role, she wants to know, what role could media campaigns play, or could they play a role? Yes,
total. Paul, do you want to table this question? Let's table it for after absorption.
Yeah, let's table.
But let's write it down and let's think through it. This is good. We're going to get to talk through it. So, team, the last part that I would say is absorption. So if you can repeat with me absorption, that would be good. Say absorption. Great. Perfect. Everybody's saying with me. Amazing. Sorry, I cannot see you. I'm a trainer kind of guy. Okay. So then the question becomes, once we have mass movement, what the heck do we do with all these people? and we put a little vacuum there, because the question really becomes, well, there's all these people out there that want to get engaged, and how do we do that? And for example, I'll tell you a quick story. About maybe 8-9 years ago, we did this big action here in Massachusetts in the State House. We said, we're going to do this large coming out action called Why We Can Be, based on the MLK letter, so we can get some rights to undocumented students here. And it was just like a small group of us. There was like maybe 10 or 15 of us on the planning committee, and we're thinking, well, maybe 100 students we can mobilize, right? 400 students came. And I was just like, holy guacamole. 400 came, they put themselves in the staircase, they were part of the action, it was pretty cool. And then my whole time I was thinking, I don't have anybody's phone numbers. I didn't get them at the action. I didn't tell them what I didn't even know what the heck we were doing next. The whole thing was the action. I didn't have a plan for afterwards, you know, a larger escalation plan or anything like that. And you know, for a while that triggered my imagination of how we needed to build a larger organization. But I was like, holy guacamole. There was a hot moment. Students were convinced. We had a lot of media, and I didn't digest them into the organization. So another way to look at absorption is to look through digestion, right? So let's talk to that for a second. One example that I want to mention is that this is actually the picture of how we started United We Dream in 2009. And there were only really 7 founding groups to start in the network. And we did a lot of mass training, meaning that we went out and we talked to a lot of people about the organization, what our campaign was. We trained, we developed teams, right? I went on the road from 20 out of 30 days for about 4 years to build the organization, right? And there were multiple trigger events. There was the Arizona SB 1070, then there were arrests of students. There was this large mobilization in DC, the vote on the DREAM Act. And all the time that we had massive momentum, or that for me was a lot of momentum because I wasn't used to it that much, we did a lot of training and large meetings and congresses and large events to digest membership. My leaders will go crazy because our first Congress, our first meeting, we had 40 people nationally. The next one, we had 80. The third one, we had 120. The next Congress, we had 300 people. And they were like, where are these new leaders coming out of the woodwork? But we were creating a process for people to build organization and get integrated into the organization. Even the last Congress that I was there, we had around 500 to 600 people. It was massive. And people were like, how do you have all these people? And I would keep saying, this is the way that we integrate them into the culture of the organization and how they can go out and do more campaigns. So it started really like this. And in 2010, we increased by 30 groups across the country. Actually, this picture is a little older, so probably this is more than 40 or 50. But it increased dramatically. And to me, in organizing, how the heck can you do that, you know? How can you go from 17 to 30 in a year or to 15 in 3? You know, to me, it was just insane, you know? So that's the power of absorption. But then absorption, we think, is actually done through a ladder of engagement. And we know that you may be seeing this ladder of engagement at all. And a lot of people will tell you, well, you know, NOI has one or this other group has one. We think we have the best one. No, I'm just kidding. But, you know, but we think we have one that actually explains what are the key components of the ladder that will get you to absorb. So let's actually go through a story, right? Because I think stories maybe make a little bit more sense. So let's say that Pedrito or Paul or John, whatever, I don't know how you say all those names in English, but somebody sees your great freaking action, right, on the TV, and they say, oh my God, that is so cool, and they say, oh, that's great. So then they hear that there's going to be, they go to the website, right, and there's some petition to support your cause. Great. So they take the step number 1, they climb up the ladder, and they support your cause. Great. First step they did, right? Then through email, they found out that now you're going to do this massive occupation and that they got to come and join you because it's really urgent, it's really important, it's going to cut the cost, and we're going to win with this thing, right? So second step, they take action. They come, they do the part of the action, and they go through the action, and they feel freaking excited. They're psyched. They're like, oh my God, I never knew I could be part of democracy. There's amazing people, the community, the vibe. Oh my God, I want to do more, right? Most of the time, that's it for people. But we think that the third element is mass training. And that element of mass training, which I'll go in depth here, is where people actually get to become activists and leaders of their campaign, and they understand the key elements of your strategy or your movement DNA, so then they can replicate that and do step number 4, which is team formation or become volunteer organizers. So that's just a little story to get you. So how we get people more involved, and it doesn't happen linearly. Sometimes people have to take multiple actions to then come to mass training, or people have to go through a lot of mass training and a lot of action for them to be able to form teams or even become volunteer organizers. So now we're going to go through each one of them to see how they make sense. So let's go to take action, right? So take action is pretty simple. Not going to spend a long time on this, right? In Occupy was come to the occupations. In the Montgomery bus boycott was come to the assembly or don't take the bus, right? For other people, come and join the rally. So pretty simple actions that are doable for the regular person on the streets or on their neighborhoods, right? That's the first one, take action. Number two, or numero dos, is online action, right? And by online action, we're really trying to figure out what is the biggest funnel, the biggest net that we can grab as much support as we can. So we do a large action, or we do a trigger event or election that has a lot of media. Are we capturing names online? Because those are names of future supporters, right? Are they signing the petition? Are they donating to the cause? You know, one example that I want to put out is that in 2011 we did a deportation case of a student in Texas. He was part of a fraternity, and you know he was going to get deported, I think, in like 10 days or something. And I was so impressed because we didn't actually have all these online systems before, but now that we did, we got in, I think it was in 4 days, we got 8,000 names from people that we have never ever heard of in Texas. Actually, the majority of he was in an African American fraternity. We got 8,000 black people to sign up to a list of immigration in about 3 to 4 days, and I was just like, this makes no sense. This what and. But then from there, we were able to ask those people to support us, to donate, to do more stuff, and actually we eventually stopped his deportation. So we really see online action as a way to get as many people into the fund. We're not the only ones talking about online action, right? There's, for example, here a quick slide on how NOI views some of their online organizing one-on-one, right? Specifically on what are those key moments of momentum, right, where you can put a video, you can put a message, and you can get more support, right? And here you can see, right, media increases coverage. You can tap into more media that creates a more cycle. You can get more email supporters. You create more content, and that gives you more, and you Facebook. So really how to create a cycle of even more online engagement and more momentum. One last part, or two last parts that I would say on the online piece here is number one, which is if you're not capturing the trigger events or the momentum you create, then who is? Is there another organization because they have the online tools and you don't, that they are capturing the momentum? Or are there organizations that maybe are capturing external momentum, but they're not actually getting people through the whole ladder? They're not organizing them. They go through the first step, maybe they do some of the second, and that's it. No mass training, no teams. There's no volunteers here. I just want to point that out there because there's a lot of large organizations that tap into the momentum that sometimes is external, sometimes we create, and then they take all those resources from us. That's why I want to make this point about the online infrastructure, which I think is very key. The last part that I would mention on the online piece is how do we ask people to do the most low-bar asks? So, for example, Gabby Pacheco, colleague of mine of the Dream Movement, she did this walk that was called the Trail of Dreams from Florida to Washington, D.C. And we always had this thing that because Gabby and I talked about things all the freaking time. And she was one in this big TV show of Jorge Ramos, which is kind of like the biggest personality in Spanish TV media here in the U.S. And she was on the TV with Felipe and the other leaders, and they were just wearing a shirt that said, text trail to 88 something something. And I just love how that was their promotion, and they got 5,000 new text messages or text or phone numbers just for being in the show for like 3 minutes. It was insane the way they were capturing people to just like join in, capture in. And of course, we don't think this is it. We don't think you can change the world if 3.5 million people sign a petition. That doesn't, or 3.5% of the population sign a petition. That's not going to do anything if they don't get active and get on their feet and do massive non-cooperation and demonstration. But we actually think that if we can capture the list, that could help us create stronger organization and escalate more and build more, and so forth and on. So I'll tell 2 more pieces, and then we'll leave it up for Paul so he can do volunteer. Paul, there's something you want to add on online organizing?
I just want to say, if you think I know this concept, but I'll be honest with you, most of the time in the immigrant rights movement, when I was part of May 1st in 2006, No one was out there with a clipboard getting people to sign up. No one was there with laptops getting people to sign up on the email list. We had 1.2 million people march. We don't have their phone numbers. We don't have their emails. If we had captured that, we would have had one of the most powerful email lists in the country. We would have been able to raise millions and millions of dollars for the movement. But we didn't have the foresight or the infrastructure to get those people, so that those people wanted to participate more. We didn't even know how to communicate with them. So you need the biggest net to bring people in. And you have to think about signing everybody up. Every single action needs to sign people up.
And Paul, and also this goes along in the way we want to have these three concepts and have them all intertwined together is because sometimes even in our email list and our online organizing, we are not talking to the whole public. Sometimes we're just talking to our supporters. And that's also another reason, because of the language that we use in our email, email alerts or whatever we send out to capture petitions, that we don't even understand how to capture the broad public, because the broad public sometimes doesn't understand our movement or political lingo or what we're even framing the issues at. So I'll just end with that piece. So we talked about online piece. The third thing that I will talk, which is the third ladder, is mass training. And I know I said for the last couple of minutes that you need to tattoo yourself stuff, erase all the other tattoos, put the mass training tattoo there, because to me the mass training piece is the biggest piece. And I could tell you from experience that there will be not such a thing as a dream movement if it wasn't for mass training. And I know it's a bold thing to say, but I think I can say it. Mass training was pretty key. So I'll tell you two pieces around this. One, really, I learned mass training through Marshall Gantz, because when the Obama campaign was having massive momentum, Marshall came with the idea of doing the Obama camps, that pretty much all the new volunteers they could funnel through this training component where they will give them enough instruction on the campaign strategy, on the campaign story, on the campaign structure, and then we'll send them back out and do more work. So Marshall really mastered that a lot, and the people at the Obama campaign mastered a lot. People at NOI mastered that a lot. When you have momentum, how to integrate them and do mass training. Marshall at some point in 2000 said to me and another leader, can we go do trainings for immigration reform? And that's how I learned how to systematize the mass training piece, right? But for example, in our first year in United, we did probably train about maybe 1,500 people. It was insane. Because I would just go to any town, and if I find 50 people, which I will pull up through relationship and structure, I will train them, they will form teams, and then I will give them the campaign strategy for the next 5 months. That's as much as we had thought about at that time. They will get the DNA of the Dream Movement, which was here the cap and gowns, the meta-narrative, right? We are young students here in the U.S. We're American as apple pie. You got to accept us, right? Whatever the story was. They will get the strategy piece, right? And they will understand something about how to form teams, build relations. They will get organizing skills. Mass training is the best thing you can do for absorbing momentum and training your people. There's a set of ways how to do it. I don't think there's one way. I think there could be multiple ways to do it. But I think training is one of the most important things for the integration of the escalation into a stronger organization. And actually, another case on this was in 2010 on the Arpaio campaign. I was part of supporting some of the training there. And on the Arpaio campaign, there was a moment where the campaign couldn't get to us the people that they wanted to through their structure. And in NOI, you will hear this a lot in the people that actually are the older NOI organizers. They will tell you, when you cannot have enough organizers to reach the people, you have to do massive training. And people will tell you that makes no sense, because if you're constantly doing canvassing, if you're going out in the streets, to do a training, it takes a lot of resources. It means that you have to pull organizers out of the field, pull canvassers out of the field to do recruitment of volunteers, right? And then do this big training, and what is that going to do? And what we always notice after those trainings will happen, and I did that also in Florida with 150 immigrant workers for the PICO campaign in Orlando, they would say, why would you spend all this time? It's that afterwards, people would able to have enough information for them to self-organize themselves in decentralized teams that then they can grow exponentially. And in Arizona, I think they registered was it 34,000 registered voters on that election cycle. They registered more people than Cesar Chavez did in the 80s. It was humongous. It was like the largest voter engagement drive they done. And they could tell you why. One part was mass training. Certainly 30 or 40% of the strategy was mass training. For us in Florida, we went from 150 people to putting about 2,000 people in the church 2 weeks later in a place where we had no relationships. And they were like, how the heck you did that? And I was like, mass training. So I'm going to stop because I know you tattoo mass training on yourself, and I know you love it, and you know it's cool. So I'll talk about the last thing before Paul ends this conversation. Team structure.
In the next training, we're going to talk a little bit more detailed about what we think is the ideal mass training program in the next webinar. We're just introducing the concept of mass training.
Thank you, Paul. Love the commercial. So team structure, the last piece, and then I'll leave it to Paul. So we can discuss a lot about team structure, but there are some specific elements that really make a team work, and there are elements that do not make a team work. For example, one thing that we found out through the NOI and the Dream Movement experience is that we couldn't have teams that were larger than 7 people, or that people, and the reason why we found this out is because after 7 people, people had a really hard time strategizing. It just became too complicated to strategize. We found out that 7 was the right number. We didn't have any data on this. It just happened through experience. But really on team structure, we're trying to figure out how to get people to have roles of leadership, right? And I know many people have been through the NOI team structure training, like how to have a team captain, how to have an online organizer, a recruiter, all the good stuff. Those things are great. I actually think what is useful is when you actually have team structure and you pick the best person to be the coordinator or the team through process C, not through structure, not through relationship, but through process, can select the best person to lead the team. So we're going to go more in detail next week about team structure, about how to do that, and even how to give advanced training to your team structure, how to get all recruiters in one training, how to get all team coordinators in one training, because it's really important for them to develop the skills, to develop their teams, and keep running through. So I'll start with team structure, and Paul will talk about the last component of the ladder, which to me it's so key, which actually in the Dream Movement I got a couple of people to drop out of college to become voluntary organizers, which I feel really proud and guilty about. But Paul, voluntary organizing infrastructure.
One thing that makes social movements different than professional organizations or just electoral campaigns is that they have an infrastructure where you can drop out. You can get so energized by the movement, you drop out, and whether it's the freedom houses that SNCC had in the civil rights movement, whether it's Obama campaign, they had a whole network of supporters that housed people, whether it's in Serbia, a lot of people dropped out because young people didn't have jobs in that economy in Serbia. In the United Farm Workers, they had farm worker houses where volunteers could drop out and pretty much get paid nothing and work full-time for the movement. And you need to have that infrastructure. Gandhi is one of the most famous people. He creating voluntary organizing structures. He called them ashrams, which was part of the monastic tradition within Hinduism. And he created lots of different movement ashrams that became the base of the volunteer organizers who basically coordinated the entire movement. And that is the last and somewhat very important part of the ladder that allows the whole infrastructure to maintain itself, is when you allow people to drop out and to organize full-time for the movement.
So Paul, let's do the last review so we can open up for questions, right? So we're saying if you take large nonviolent action for a popular demand, either small actions, trigger events, that can help us create a moment of the whirlwind. Is that right, Paul?
Yes, you do it, Carlos.
Perfect. And then once we create those moments of the whirlwind, which will create popular support, not all the time you need the moment of the whirlwind, by the way. Those moments are rare. We just want to put that out there, that it's hard to create those as two people that have not created those, but certainly trigger events. And once you do that, you need to absorb the momentum, right? So that's why we have the little vacuum. Let's see if the vacuum works. Oh my God, it moves. It totally works. And that allows us then to create more strong movement or organization. And sometimes we can create voluntary infrastructure support which is what sustains the movement. Which is, I know some people do fellowships, some people do low-paid organizing jobs. When I started organizing, I got paid $1,000 for maybe 2 years every month for a while, and then I would put half of the money into the movement either way. So it was like I was living in poverty for a while. So, and actually for us, that's the movement tradition, which is not that people get paid for everything, because we're working on issues that most people are not interested in, that the power structure is against. So we got to figure out how to support each other in the voluntary simplicity tradition to do this work. So
and I know it's hard. Actually, I live right now in voluntary simplicity. The Center for the Working Poor has modeled itself on the Gandhian ashram. Everyone that works full-time at the Center for the Working Poor gets a stipend of $200 a month in room and board, and that's it. So it's a simple lifestyle. I like it, but it is challenging on many levels, and I wouldn't expect everyone to do it.
That's right. Thank you, Paul. But we want to make sure that we put all the options there. And team, that's it. Those are the 3 elements of the theory. Just a quick review, and now let's open it up for questions and comments.
Cool. So we did get one comment from Curtis. He said that the webinars are fantastic, that we have strong facilitation, that the graphics and visuals are very helpful for fleshing out the concepts, and that it's very helpful as dream defenders think about their training and development program.
Good. Perfect. Bill, is there a way that we can open up for questions just if people want to speak?
Yeah, totally. So now that we're sort of done with the facilitation part, if you just want to speak, you can submit a question and I'll give you the mic and we can hear from you.
Or feedback too. It's
yeah.
helpful.
What was useful? Yeah.
One thing that I was thinking, actually, that I thought was kind of interesting, if I could talk a little, was that, like, Curtis was asking about how the civil resistance stuff can be adapted for issues, and I thought it was interesting to think about how the like, spectrum of allies or spectrum of support thing that we're working with a lot here was actually developed by people in the Clamshell Alliance who, like, did the mass mobilization stuff, but around an issue. Because a lot of the civil resistance stuff is about dictators, but that was specifically about an issue.
Within any issue group, if you're going to pick a campaign that is the most popular with your base or with the public, and you say, what is the most symbolic demand that everyone effing loves, that gets fired up in this cause? I mean, I think DREAM Act is a great one. I mean, I think if you were to do polling about all the different sub-issues within immigrant rights, the DREAM Act would be one of the most popular ones. It's a very sympathetic constituency. People who didn't really have much, they can't be blamed for making that choice of whether or not they're here, that want to be Americans, at least that's how it's framed, they're dreamers. I mean, I think that's a great symbolic issue to build a movement around. But a lot of issues aren't so good to do that.
Right. And some issues, as we will see in many movements, start when public opinion is not in your favor. I mean, that's where we started. And I think the question, for me, it's not how do you get civil resistance to work for issues. To me, it's how do we make issues into popular demands? Because usually that's the challenge. Yeah. Issues into, like, let's stop talking the issue legislative political lingo. Let's talk about popular demands so that we can massively mobilize the public on it.
And how about Sharika's question about the role of media campaigns? Sharika, do you want to flesh out that idea a little bit more? Is there anything specific that you're looking for? Here, you have the mic if you want to speak. Okay, I don't know if she's there.
Anybody else want to give feedback? Tell us what's useful, and that would be helpful for us.
Here, Sharika, it should work now. It should work, but it's not working. Okay, but she said it's a pretty general question, just about the role of media campaigns.
You want to take this, Carlos?
I can. In 2010, so the media is super duper, ooper, mooper, looper, I don't know how many oopers I can say, important. And I think the challenge that we all have is how do we capture the media imagination because they get tired pretty quickly. So I think the interesting thing is how do we have some media attention and how do we build more momentum with the media? So one thing that I did not know is that in 2010 when we pushed for the DREAM Act vote, the day of the vote when we went to the U.S. Senate, the day before we got a call from Univision, from the Univision executives, we got a call from Jorge Ramos. And he said to us, how can I help? And we said, just show the vote the next day. And because we were in Congress, we didn't even get to see it, because we were in the middle of the whole thing. But they showed it. They stopped their whole Saturday programming, and they showed the whole thing from like 9 a.m. until 1 p.m. or something like that. And I don't know how many millions of people saw it. So I think media is super duper important, and I think there are multiple ways to create relationships with the media, but also to do actions that capture the media, like the blood drives and other stuff that it's really wacky and out of really sight. That's why we like the dilemma actions piece. But the media is so important to build what we want to do. That's why we want to do large events and we want to do escalation. And actually, Paul, it would be good if you can talk about disruption and sacrifice as the one or two elements that attract a lot of attention to then get media.
Well, we talk about this as the spectrum of disruption and the spectrum of sacrifice, which is there's many different types of actions that require more sacrifice or less from your participants, like hunger striking till death. It takes a lot of sacrifice, or hunger striking, or marching for a long period of time, or even occupying where you sleep out. Those are highly sacrificial acts, and some of them are even more disruptive, like general strikes and stuff. A lot of what we're thinking about is how do you escalate to a point where you're getting lots of people to make deep sacrifices, and you want to, at the right time, create lots of disruption too. If you can do both of those things, then, and you hit a critical mass of that, you really do get the spotlight. Like, if you can get a couple thousand people arrested, I'm guaranteeing that you're going to get front page newspaper coverage in whatever your locality is, if not nationally. If you can get to 8,000 people being arrested, if you can do a big strike, you will get coverage. If you can do mass hunger striking, you can get coverage. So if you can't do that, you can do you can do smaller amounts of people doing higher levels of sacrifice or higher levels of disruption. I'm not going to get into the details about that, but I think that we need to start thinking about how to escalate, because escalating to high levels of sacrifice and disruption is really how we get the media engaged at a totally different level. And most organization is really just thinking about the bottom rungs of the ladder of engagement, and they're not thinking about how to do the high sacrificial, high disruptive stuff. And we might have to build to get there, but if we don't think about building to get there from the beginning, we're never going to get there. Because a lot of organizations, they spend their whole history, they have tens of millions of dollars, they have tens of thousands of people in their base, and they never do high disruptive, high sacrificial actions. And they never create moments of the whirlwind.
Cool.
Carlos, I can't hear you.
No, I was saying they just ask them to sign a petition or to come to a house meeting. And they even patronize people a lot, saying, well, I don't think people are ready to do that. There's all that stuff, all this myths around what people cannot escalate around. But people have to make their own choices.
So it's a couple minutes past 8:30, and I think we're gonna start losing people. Is there anything that y'all want to tell the participants that they should be aware of, like any readings or anything like that?
Before you go on readings, Paul, I just want to pre-frame the next webinar, if that's okay, and then I'll let you, so you can close it down, Paul. But next webinar, we're going to talk about, well, what are the best models and practices? So now we're going to go into the detail specifics of, well, what are the right practices for mass training, for team formation, for polarization, for escalation that we think are the best, so that people can try them out and look at some examples. So pretty much we're going to answer the question of what is the most effective way to do the cycle of momentum. That is for the next class. So Paul, do you want to close it down?
I just want to say this, that this next webinar is my favorite webinar, and some of these lessons I learned from Serbian revolutionaries who formed the student movement that toppled their dictator, Milosevic, in Serbia. And these models there's a lot of different models all across the globe that are decentralized, that specifically figure out how to absorb momentum. And we've learned a lot about those models, and we want you guys to be the first ones in the United States to take those models and to use them in the U.S. context, and to create our own version of those models here in the U.S. But the next webinar is the one where we go over some of the details of how to do that.
It is pretty cool.
And hopefully you get to do it.
And Paul, for homework, Belinda will send that out, right? We'll send out the readings
Yes.
for homework.
Mm-hmm.
So there's three readings that I want you guys to talk about. One is about the climate change, the inside-outside game, a little about the theory of power of how to win on climate change, which helps you kind of see what active popular support. Another one about Martin Luther King giving up his guns, how he discovered the art and science of civil resistance, and how that blew his mind, and how after that he became a historical figure by creating Moments of the Whirlwind. So there's that second article, and we're going to send you out some other smaller articles, but those are the two major ones.
Cool.
Thank you, team, for everyone to join us. Hear you next Tuesday. Thank you so much.
Great. Curtis says he's hyped, and I'm hyped as well because I actually haven't read those yet.
Bye-bye, everybody. See you in third webinar.
Bye, guys. And please look out for the readings because I'll be emailing those.
I'll send it to you right now.